In the West, justice often hung from the end of a rope. The weak had no voice. The strong decided who would live and who would die. Caleb Stratton, a quiet and solitary man, had only ever wanted a patch of land where he could live in peace. But when he stumbled upon an Apache girl about to be killed by cruel hands, everything changed. To save her meant to stand against an entire town, against prejudice, against hatred carved into blood. And he chose a road from which there was no return. Welcome to Wild West storytelling. Let's get started. The prairie wind that evening carried with it the smell of dust and rusted iron. A smell that foretold something dark waiting ahead. Caleb Stratton had been riding since dawn, hoping only to find a quiet place to spend the rest of his life. But as he crossed the final ridge, silence shattered. Below, beside a dried creek bed, a crude wooden frame had been driven into the earth. From its crossbeam dangled a frail figure barefoot, arms bound and stretched high above her head. Not a corpse. At least, not yet. The girl still twitched weakly in the hot wind, her toes scraping at the dirt as if clawing for one more breath. Caleb's gut turned to stone. He had seen legal hangings in town, judges, crowds, prayers. But this was different. No law, no justice, only naked cruelty. Beside her leaned a charred plank, words carved jagged and merciless. No place for her kind. Caleb's hand went instinctively to his rifle, though no enemy stood before him, only a life slipping away. He spurred his horse down the slope, gravel scattering under its hooves. By the time he reached her, the girl's lips were blue, her wide eyes wild with terror yet refusing to surrender. "Hold on," Caleb rasped. With one swift stroke of his knife, he cut the rope. Her body collapsed into his arms, light as a broken branch. Her breath came ragged, trembling, each gasp a battle of its own. Caleb's eyes swept the horizon. The cowards who had done this could not be far. The wind howled through the canyon, whispering a warning. By saving this girl, Caleb had just set himself against the men who had already decreed that she did not deserve to live. "Thank you for letting me serve you tonight. Tell me where you are listening from. My only hope is that you remain safe and find happiness, wherever in this world you may be." Caleb Stratton was a man in his 40s, tall and lean, his face more weathered by sun and wind than by age itself. His hair had turned gray a decade earlier than most, and his steel-colored eyes were cold, watchful, always wary. Folks in the town of Cold Rock used to say, "That man spends more time with horses and rifles than with people." 8 years ago, Caleb had been a notorious hired gun, roaming the frontier with his Winchester and a trail of bloody rumors in his wake. But the day his wife and only son were caught in a train robbery, he failed to stop. Caleb cast it all away. He buried his guns in a wooden chest, built a shack out on the prairie, and chose solitude so that he would never again have to hear anyone call his name. Since then, his life had passed like a shadow. Mornings spent in the fields, evenings with a pot of thin soup, hours staring into dying embers. His only companion was an old horse, his only confidant, cheap corn whiskey. He thought he had learned how to grow old quietly, until this afternoon, when fate dragged him back with the sight of a young woman strung up by a creek bed. He laid the girl on the soft earth, his hands trembling as he checked her breath. She was alive barely. The ropes had cut deep into her wrists, bruises running the length of her thin arms. Her face was young, perhaps no more than 20, her cheeks hollow, yet her eyes still glimmered with a faint spark. "Who did this to you?" Caleb muttered, not really expecting an answer. The girl whispered weakly, her cracked lips shaping sounds he almost could not hear. He leaned closer and realized it was not English. It was Apache. His heart tightened. Once, long ago, he had ridden with soldiers chasing the Apache across those barren mountains. He had seen their blood stain the rocks. And now, an Apache girl lay in his care. Caught between life and death, he draped his coat over her, tightened the straps on his horse, and carried her back to his cabin. Along the way, the wind howled, sweeping red dust through the valleys, carrying with it echoes that warned him this choice would change his destiny. The small wooden shack emerged at the foot of the hill, its roof sagging, the hearth cold since morning. Inside, there was little more than a rough-hewn bed, a clumsy table, and an old gun rack layered in dust. Caleb laid the girl upon the bed, stoked a fire in the stove, and set water to boil. In the flickering glow, her face came into clearer view, young, resilient, yet scarred by wounds, and a harshness no short life should have endured. Caleb watched in silence. And he knew. From the moment he cut that rope, he had stepped out of the shell of solitude he had built for 8 long years. And now, new enemies would surely come. The fire crackled in the stove, its flickering glow casting restless shadows across the wooden walls, like ghosts from the past. Caleb set a bowl of warm water beside him, dipped a strip of coarse cloth, and gently wiped the dirt and dried blood from the girl's face. Each time he touched her, her frail body flinched, like a wild creature long accustomed to the whip. "It is all right," Caleb whispered, though he knew she likely understood none of his words. Her eyes opened again. The firelight reflected in those dark pupils, and Caleb shivered. In them he saw more than fear. He saw something else, something he had witnessed before in survivors of the battlefield. A will that refused to yield. Her lips trembled, shaping a hoarse sound. "Nantan," Caleb frowned. He could not tell if it was a name or a word in Apache. "Nantan?" he repeated, pointing to his own chest. "Caleb," she stared at him, then gave the faintest nod. A fragile beginning. Outside, the wind rattled through the cracks, carrying with it the faint smell of smoke from afar. Caleb realized his time was short. The men who had built that scaffold would surely return to confirm their work. And when they saw the rope cut, they would know someone had interfered. He turned back to the girl. "Listen, they will come here. If you stay, both of us will be in danger." He spoke slowly, firmly, as if hoping she would understand through his eyes. She said nothing, but her thin hand suddenly gripped his wrist. Caleb froze. It was not strong, but it was desperate. Her eyes spoke what her lips could not. "Do not leave me." Caleb drew a long breath, feeling the weight he had avoided for 8 years settle once again on his shoulders. He thought of his wife and son, of the night he had lost everything, of the vow he had made never to be bound to anyone again. But fate never asked permission. "Nantan," he repeated, his voice lower, steadier. "From now on, you stay here. But you must be ready for what is coming." Her head fell back, her eyelids sliding shut with exhaustion. Caleb pulled a heavier blanket over her, then rose and turned toward the rack by the wall. His hand brushed the thick layer of dust from an old Winchester rifle. He had sworn never to touch it again. But now, the sound of her fragile breath was enough to pull him back into a world of fire and blood. In that moment, Caleb knew. Saving her life was only the beginning. This was the spark of a war he could not escape. A war against the entire town of Cold Rock, where justice had long ago been sold for silver. At dawn, the first light crept through the cracks of the weathered shack. Caleb had been awake for hours, sitting in a wooden chair with the Winchester laid across his knees. His eyes scanned the prairie, where the wind swept red dust into long trails, signs that someone had passed through in the night. Behind him, a soft cough stirred the silence. The Apache girl was awake. Caleb turned to find her dark eyes glinting with caution. She glanced around like a wild bird cornered in a cage. He poured warm water into a tin cup and handed it to her. "Drink," she hesitated, then took it with trembling hands. As the water slid down her throat, her face eased slightly, her lips shaping a faint word. "Gracias." The Spanish was out of place, but enough to make Caleb pause. "You speak that?" he asked. She shook her head, her eyes still distrustful. Caleb guessed she must have wandered close to the Mexican border at some point. In that moment, he realized her survival was not luck. Inside her was a strength beaten down but unbroken. He rose, pointing at the bruises around her wrists. "Who did this?" She bit her lip, silent. But when the sound of hoofbeats drifted from the valley, her eyes flared with hatred. Caleb stepped onto the porch. Below, 3 riders advanced along the trail. Even at a distance, the morning sun flashed on the silver badges pinned to their chests. Deputies. The law of the town. Caleb's grip tightened on his rifle. He knew these men. They had once shared whiskey with him at the saloon in Cold Rock, men who now wore silver stars, but whose souls stank no less than the bandits on the open road. If they were the ones who had strung the girl up last night, then this was no longer a matter of small injustices. This was the system itself. He turned back inside, his voice low but firm. "Nantan, hide." He pointed to the small cellar door behind the stove. She understood, nodding quickly. Caleb drew a long breath, then walked back out to the porch. He sat on the wooden steps, Winchester laid across his lap, his eyes locked on the road ahead. The hoofbeats grew louder, red dust rising like a storm. And Caleb knew the solitary life he had built for 8 long years was gone. From the moment he cut that noose, he had signed his own death warrant with the law of Cold Rock. But this time, he would not turn away. Thank you for being here. If this story has brought back old memories, dusty sunsets, the thunder of hoofbeats echoing in your chest, then subscribe to my channel, so that every day, we can sit together once more, and I will share with you another tale of the Wild West. The 3 riders reined in before Caleb's shack. The jangle of iron bridles and the snort of horses filled the silence, heralding the standoff to come. At their head was Deputy Brackett, a scar slashing across his left cheek, his eyes as cold as steel. He sat tall in the saddle, staring down at Caleb with the arrogance of power. "Good morning, Stratton," Brackett rasped, his voice rough with tobacco. "Someone claims they saw you pulling something down from the scaffold by the creek. We are here to confirm." Caleb remained seated on the porch steps, his Winchester laid across his knees, his thumb brushing the safety catch. "All I saw was a bird tangled in rope," he said flatly. The 2 deputies behind him sneered. "A bird? One the size of a person?" One of them mocked, his hand already resting on his pistol. Brackett's voice dropped, heavy with threat. "You know the law of Cold Rock. No Apache sets foot here. If one of them is still breathing, then that one is a criminal." Caleb met his gaze. "A criminal?" His voice cut like wind through stone. "Or the gallows you built for sport?" The air grew taut. Inside the shack, Nantan held her breath in the cellar. Hearing every word, Brackett spat into the dirt. "Listen, Stratton, we do not want trouble. Just hand the girl over. Simple. You go back to your whiskey and your horse." Slowly, Caleb rose to his feet. His eyes, dulled for years by grief and solitude, now burned like coals stirred from the ashes. "For 8 years, I kept to myself. But yesterday, you turned this land into a graveyard of nooses. If you want the girl, you will have to walk over my corpse." A suffocating silence followed. The wind kicked red dust into the air, blurring the world like a curtain about to rise. Brackett's lips curled into a smile. "If that is your choice," he nodded. In the same heartbeat, the 2 deputies drew their pistols. Caleb swung the Winchester to his shoulder with the breath of a man who had done this 1,000 times. The sound of metal locking into place was sharp. Pang! 3 shots split the morning, tearing the silence to shreds. A bullet ripped into the porch beam, splintering wood. Caleb dropped low, firing back twice in quick succession. One deputy toppled from his saddle, crashing into the dust. The other panicked, yanking his reins hard. But Caleb's rifle cracked again, the shot grazing the horse's muzzle. The beast reared high, screaming, throwing its rider to the ground. His pistol flew from his grasp. Only Brackett remained. He sat steady in the saddle, fury blazing in his eyes. "You just signed your own death warrant, Stratton. The whole town will hunt you, and this time, no one will save you." Caleb leveled the Winchester at his chest. "I do not need saving. I have already chosen." At that moment, the door of the shack creaked open. Nantan stepped out, her black eyes burning though her body still trembled. She stood behind Caleb, silent but unyielding, her presence a declaration. This fight was no longer his alone. The gun smoke drifted away, leaving behind the acrid sting that mingled with the morning wind. On the porch lay the body of a deputy, while Brackett had already spurred his horse into the distance, his threats still echoing in the air. Caleb lowered the Winchester, his hands trembling slightly. Not from fear, but from something he had buried for 8 years, the familiar stir of a man who once lived by killing. Behind him, Nantan stood with her shoulders trembling. She clung to the doorframe, her dark eyes fixed on the trail of red dust where Brackett had vanished. Her bare feet were caked with earth, yet her gaze had changed. It was no longer only fear, it carried the flicker of resolve. Caleb turned to her, extending a hand. "Come inside. They will return, and with more men." Inside the cabin, the firelight danced against their faces. Caleb sat heavily in his chair, removing his hat and setting it aside. He studied the Apache girl for a long while before asking quietly, "What do they call you? What is your true name?" She drew the blanket tight around her thin frame, her voice raspy but steady. "Nantan. In my people's tongue, it means one who speaks with spirits." Caleb gave a slow nod. The name weighed on him like a prophecy. He lit a cigarette, the smoke curling upward, and asked in a gravelly tone, "Why do they want you dead?" Nantan lifted her gaze. The firelight gleamed in her eyes, and for the first time, she let the truth spill out. "Because I saw what they did. Sheriff Brackett and his deputies, they killed an Apache chief to steal land. I was there. I lived. I ran. Now they fear what I know." Caleb fell silent. He thought of the years he had ridden with soldiers, of blood spilled between white men and natives. But never had the injustice been so stark, lawmen turning executioners. Nantan clenched her hands, her voice breaking. "My father said the wind carries the souls of the dead away, but I cannot keep running. If I die, the truth dies with me." Caleb's head bowed slightly. In her eyes, he saw the ghost of his wife, eyes that once burned with faith, until snuffed out on a fateful night. And he knew he could not turn away. "Listen," Caleb said, his voice rough as gravel. "You can stay here, for a while. I will keep them from you. But soon we must think further, because next time, it will not be only 3. Nantan studied him for a long moment. Then, suddenly, she placed her bruised hand over his rough, scarred one. "You saved me, which means you chose. From now on, your fate is bound with mine." Caleb gave a faint, weary smile, a rare expression after so many years. "I was never good at choosing, but maybe, this time, I chose right." Outside, the wind rattled the plains, carrying the hoarse cries of crows across the gray sky. An omen. Both of them knew. The real storm had only just begun. The next morning, the prairie awoke beneath a veil of silver mist. Caleb led his horse to the well, his rough hand sliding along the reins like a man too long accustomed to solitude. But now, there were eyes watching him from the wooden doorway. Nantan sat quietly, her thin face set with resolve, as though overnight her fear had hardened into will. It was not long before dust rose again along the dirt road. But this time it was not only Brackett. A full dozen riders followed him, faces hidden behind scarves, rifles aimed and ready. The town had chosen to silence the truth with blood. Caleb tucked away the cigarette he had not lit, his hand gripping the Winchester tight. He was no longer the man who avoided the fight. Standing on the porch, he was like an old oak rooted against the storm. "Caleb Ward," Brackett's voice rang out, smug and cruel. "Hand over the girl, and you still have a chance to live." Caleb gave a low, sharp laugh that cut the morning like a blade. "I once handed friends over to your so-called law, and they died in silence. This time, no." The first gunshot cracked, then echoed into a storm that swallowed the valley. Caleb fired back, each shot precise and unyielding, driving the shadows into retreat. Nantan no longer cowered. She knelt by the window, reloading for him, her hands trembling but determined. Amid the smoke and fury, their eyes met, and in that glance they understood. This was no longer a fight for survival. It was a fight for the truth. By the time the sun climbed high, half the riders lay scattered on the ground. Brackett, bleeding from a wound, fell from his horse but managed to crawl into the dust. Caleb raised his rifle to finish it, but Nantan laid a hand on his shoulder and shook her head. "Let him live. Death does not bring justice, only truth does." Hoofbeats thundered from afar. Not Brackett's reinforcements, but a band of Apache warriors, the people of Nantan. At their head rode an old chief, his eyes stern yet filled with sorrow. They had searched for her for weeks, and now they stood before undeniable proof. The law of Cold Rock was guilty. Brackett was seized, dragged before the eyes of the Apache and the few townsfolk brave enough to stand up. Nantan stepped forward, her voice rising across the valley. "Men may try to smother fire with violence, but the wind will always carry the embers. The truth will not die." Caleb stood beside her in silence. In that moment, he knew he had found again what he had once lost. The belief that even a broken man could choose differently, and choose rightly. When the Apache led Nantan home, she turned back, her gaze lingering longer than any words could. Caleb did not reach for her, nor try to hold her. He only gave a small nod, as a man who understood his road now curved another way. On the porch, Caleb sat down, poured himself a measure of old whiskey, and watched the trail of dust fade into the horizon. A weary but genuine smile tugged at his lips. He murmured to himself, Perhaps this prairie still has room for truth, and for lost souls like me. The wind swept across the land, carrying with it the cry of crows into the endless sky. And the west turned its wheel of fate once more. As the sunset bled across the horizon, the vast prairie returned to its eternal silence. Caleb sat alone on the old wooden porch, listening to the wind whisper through the thatched roof, the distant lowing of cattle, and the hollow space in his chest now patched by something he could not quite name. For years he had hidden, living like a man already cast aside, letting memory and guilt gnaw at his soul. But in the moment he reached out and pulled a young woman back from the edge of death, everything had changed. No one chooses where they are born, nor the shadow cast over their lives. Caleb had once been shackled by his past. Nantan had been crushed beneath cruelty. Yet when the two of them stood together beneath the hail of bullets, they made another choice: to stand with the truth, even if the cost was their lives. And it was that choice, not victory or defeat, that defined who they were. To outsiders, Caleb was still just a lonely cattleman, stripped of honor. But he knew the truth. Sometimes justice is not carried on the silver star pinned to a chest, but in the quiet decision of one man, not to abandon the weaker beside him. Nantan too walked away with her people, but her steps were no longer the same. She was no longer the wounded child, but a woman carrying the unbroken memory of the compassion of a stranger. This story reminds us of one thing: the West was not built on bullets and gold alone, but also on the rare moments when men and women chose mercy over hatred. And just as the wind never ceases across the prairie, truth and kindness may be buried, but they never die. Caleb struck a match, lit a cigarette, and let the smoke curl upward, fading into the twilight. He smiled, a rare smile after so many years. Deep down, he knew he was no hero, but neither was he a fugitive anymore. The prairie stretched on, and another night would fall, but he had learned how to keep walking, not only for himself, but for the souls he once thought he had lost. If this story has touched your heart, subscribe to the channel and leave your thoughts in the comments below. Would you choose safety and silence, or dare to stand with the truth, even if it left you alone? Thank you for riding along with Wild West storytelling. Join us again for the next tale, for the West still holds countless fates waiting to be told in blood, in tears, and in hope.